When did your family realize you weren't just another irresponsible teen mom? I'm the happiest I've ever been, but my family still says I should have aborted instead of ruining my life. Not exaggerating. My Aunt Patty will literally take my daughter out of my arms without asking, announcing I need a break before I've even said hello. Having Gracie at 18 didn't help my case. My relatives all whispered about me being another statistic. During the labor, they asked my fiancé when he's planning his escape. Even now, my grandmother keeps trying to feed Gracie because apparently I'm doing it all wrong. She'll snatch the spoon from my hand mid-feeding and announce how I'm the black sheep who can't even feed her baby right. Last weekend at my cousin Rachel's birthday party was when I hit my boiling point. The whole extended family was there. Aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins, everyone with an opinion about my life choices. During lunch setup, my Uncle Dennis made his favorite joke about babies having babies, while staring directly at me. I literally saved lives for a living. Then my mom's friend Carol cornered me by the drinks table. "Such a shame," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You had so much potential. Now you're stuck playing house instead of living your life." My husband was getting Gracie's diaper bag from the car when my uncles intercepted him. I watched from the window as Uncle Dennis placed his hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to stay. No one would judge you for leaving. You're too young to be tied down." They actually offered to help him find an apartment. When he came back in, they seated the three of us at a separate table, making a clear statement. I actually felt happier that way, until Aunt Patty swooped in and grabbed Gracie off her high chair without asking. "You looked overwhelmed, sweetheart," she told me. "Babies are hard, aren't they? Do you regret it now that you know what it's like?" She carried Gracie away before I could respond, parading my crying girl around like she'd rescued her. The moment everything came crashing down happened after the cake. My 3-year-old cousin Zachy was running around with his slice when he suddenly stopped mid-laugh. He went still, and his eyes rolled back. His little body went rigid and he collapsed. His limbs began jerking violently. His mother, my Aunt Patty, screamed, "Oh my God! Call 911! Zachy's dying!" Her husband, Uncle Dennis, rushed over with a spoon and knelt down beside his seizing child. "We need to put this in his mouth so he doesn't swallow his tongue." He tried prying Zachy's jaw open while Aunt Patty was sobbing hysterically. My other family members were either frozen or fumbling with their phones, trying to call 911 but talking over each other so loudly the operators couldn't make anything out. That's when I jumped up and pushed through the crowd. "Don't touch him! Move the chairs away. He's having a febrile seizure." I dropped to my knees. Uncle Dennis tried physically wrestling with me, screaming, "I'm going to kill Zachy." I had to grab his shoulders and shake him to tell him to stop crying and calm down. I gently turned Zachy on his side immediately, checking my phone. Starting timer now. My training was kicking in, and my husband was right beside me pulling off Zachy's sweater. "He's burning up." The fever triggered it. He motioned everyone back while I positioned Zachy's head. "Do something!" Zachy's dad shouted. "Why aren't you doing anything?" The whole family was losing their minds. The same people who told me I was young, irresponsible, and dumb were now throwing up while I was saving Zachy's life. I kept monitoring Zachy's breathing. "He's been seizing for 3 minutes," I said. "Febrile seizures usually stop within 5. We're okay right now." I turned to my husband. "Tell Patty she needs to help her child." My husband turned to Patty. "You need to talk to him like this. Low and steady." He demonstrated in a calm, rhythmic voice. "Hey, buddy. You're okay. Mom is right here. You're safe." He guided her to copy his tone while I kept Zachy positioned safely. The seizure stopped at 4 minutes and 15 seconds. Zachy was crying, confused, and scared. Brian immediately scooped him up, holding him chest to chest, humming low vibrations that calmed Zachy within seconds. "Skin-to-skin contact helps regulate their nervous system faster," he explained. Chapter 3 of my book covers post-seizure comfort techniques. "Book?" my grandmother gasped, paying more attention to the fact she was proven wrong than the fact her grandchild was alive. "Basic parenting for teen parents," I quickly said, still tending to Zachy. Patty scrambled to Google the name. 750 reviews. She turned to us like we had 5 heads. 750 reviews on a book about parenting. "And you almost let your nephew die at a birthday party," she screamed. "You should be ashamed of yourselves. Writing this stuff while not being able to protect a kid from almost dying. I'm suing for child endangerment." Before I knew it, she was on the phone with lawyers. The worst part is I knew she was serious. Because everyone's 750 reviews meant the book had made a lot of money. And once Patty saw dollar signs, nobody was stopping her. She was dead set on taking our money, our family, and our child. I couldn't move for a second, just standing there in Rachel's living room while Patty kept yelling into her phone about lawyers and lawsuits, her face getting redder with every word. Everyone was staring at me like I'd actually done something wrong, like I hadn't just saved Zachy's life minutes ago. Brian walked over and gently took Gracie from my arms without saying anything, then leaned close and told me we should leave before this got worse. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely grab our diaper bag from the chair where I'd left it. I looked around at my family, the same people who'd watched me handle that seizure perfectly, and realized they all believed Patty's version, instead of what they'd seen with their own eyes. We walked out while Patty was still screaming into her phone and nobody tried to stop us or say goodbye. The car ride home was so quiet except for Gracie babbling happily in her car seat, making those little sounds she always makes when she's content. She had no idea that our whole lives just changed in the last hour. Brian didn't say anything until we pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine. He sat there for a minute before turning to look at me, his voice steady, but I could hear the worry underneath it when he said we needed to document everything that happened today. I nodded because I was already replaying every single moment of the seizure in my head, going through each step we took and knowing we'd done everything exactly right. We got Gracie inside and I put her down for her nap while Brian got his laptop from the bedroom. He set it up on the kitchen table and opened a new document, then looked at me and said we should start from the beginning. I sat down next to him and started talking through the timeline while he typed, recording the exact times and what each family member said and did. Gracie woke up after about an hour and came toddling into the kitchen with her favorite stuffed bear, so I set her up with her blocks on the floor nearby where I could see her. Brian pulled up the seizure management chapter from his book on his phone, and we compared our actions to the published protocol step by step, confirming we'd followed every single thing perfectly. I grabbed my phone and started taking screenshots of all the book reviews before Patty's threatened lawsuit could damage them somehow, scrolling through pages of 5-star ratings and comments from parents thanking Brian for his advice. I had this sick feeling in my stomach that told me this was about to get so much worse than just threats at a birthday party. Brian must have felt the same way because he started gathering photos from the party that people had posted on Facebook earlier in the day, saving everything to a folder on his computer. By midnight, we'd created this whole folder with our timeline, all the photos, copies of Brian's book credentials, including his pediatric first aid certifications, and screenshots of everything we could think of. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I sat there looking at all this documentation, realizing my own aunt was willing to destroy us financially over something we'd handled correctly, something that saved her son's life. Brian closed his laptop and pulled me over to the couch, wrapping his arms around me and promising we'd get through this together. I wanted to believe him, but I could hear the fear in his voice too, that slight tremor that meant he was just as scared as I was about what Patty might actually do. We finally went to bed around 1 in the morning, but I barely slept, just staring at the ceiling thinking about lawyers and lawsuits and how much money we didn't have. I woke up at 6 when my phone started buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. 17 missed calls from different family members I hadn't talked to in months or even years. I opened Facebook and saw Patty had posted this long thing claiming we stood by and did nothing while Zachy nearly died, that we refused to help and just watched him seize. The post already had 43 comments and I scrolled through them feeling sicker with each one. Relatives I barely knew all agreeing I was an unfit mother who endangered a child. Someone I'd never even met commented that teen moms shouldn't be allowed to have kids. Brian found me in the bathroom at 6:30, sitting on the floor crying while I read through more comments. He took my phone away and held my hands, reminding me that social media wasn't reality, and these people didn't know what actually happened. My mom called at 7, and I actually felt hopeful for a second when I saw her name on the screen, thinking maybe she'd be on my side. I answered, and she immediately asked why I made such a scene instead of letting the adults handle Zachy's emergency. I tried to explain that I am an adult, and I literally saved his life with my medical training, but she cut me off before I could finish. She said Patty was just upset and I should apologize to keep the peace in the family. I hung up without saying goodbye because I didn't trust myself not to start yelling. Brian's phone started ringing with numbers we didn't recognize, and he ignored the first few, but finally answered one around 8. I watched his face change as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Then he said no comment and hung up. He told me it was a reporter from some local parenting blog asking about the controversial teen parent author whose negligence led to a child's hospitalization. We both realized at the same time that Patty must have contacted media outlets with her twisted version of what happened. Brian immediately called his book publisher to warn them about potential negative press coming their way. I forced myself to get ready for work because I had a shift scheduled and my patients needed me, plus I thought maybe the normalcy would help. I dropped Gracie off at daycare and drove to the hospital, trying to focus on my job instead of everything falling apart. My supervisor pulled me aside after morning rounds and asked if everything was okay at home, her voice gentle but concerned. She said someone had called the hospital claiming I was under investigation for child endangerment. I explained the whole situation as calmly as I could while internally panicking that Patty's lies were reaching my workplace now too. During my lunch break, I made the mistake of looking at Facebook again and felt physically sick reading more comments. Relatives were describing me as always irresponsible and too young to handle emergencies. People who'd barely spoken to me in years suddenly had strong opinions about my parenting. Carol had commented that she tried to warn everyone about my poor judgment, referencing those cruel things she'd said at the party about me ruining my life. Not a single family member had defended me or even acknowledged that Zachy was alive because of what I did. My phone buzzed with a text from Brian saying his book sales had dropped 30% since yesterday, and several parenting forums were discussing whether his credentials were even legitimate. His publisher was concerned about the optics and wanted to pause the whole marketing campaign until this blew over. I sat there in the break room staring at his text, realizing Patty's lawsuit threat was already costing us money, even though she hadn't actually filed anything yet. I finished my shift in a fog and drove home on autopilot, my mind replaying Brian's text about the sales drop over and over. When I pulled into our driveway, I noticed a white envelope wedged between our front door and the frame. The return address showed a law firm I'd never heard of, and my hands started shaking before I even opened it. Inside was a formal letter on heavy paper with raised letterhead. I had to read the first paragraph 3 times before the words made sense. Patty and Dennis were demanding $50,000 for emotional distress, medical expenses, and negligent supervision. The letter claimed we failed to act appropriately during Zacky's seizure and caused lasting trauma to their family. My vision got blurry as I kept reading. They wanted Brian to stop selling his book immediately and issue a public apology admitting his parenting advice was dangerous and nearly killed a child. I walked inside still holding the letter, feeling like I might throw up. Brian was in the kitchen making dinner with Gracie in her high chair, and he took one look at my face before putting down the spatula. I handed him the letter without saying anything and watched his expression change as he read it. We sat at the kitchen table for over an hour reading the letter again and again, trying to understand how saving a child's life had turned into this. The legal language made it sound like we'd stood by doing nothing while Zacky was in danger. One section actually claimed that Dennis's attempt to put a spoon in Zacky's mouth was the correct medical response, and we should have supported it instead of interfering. I started laughing because the whole thing was so ridiculous, but then the laugh turned into crying and I couldn't stop. Brian pulled his chair next to mine and held my hand while I sobbed. Gracie kept trying to give me her stuffed bear from across the table, sensing something was wrong. The letter listed specific damages including therapy costs for Zacky, lost wages for Patty who took time off work, and compensation for their ongoing emotional suffering. They'd attached a deadline of 7 days to respond, or they'd file the lawsuit in court. Brian got up and pulled our emergency folder from the drawer, the one with all our documentation from the party. We spread everything out on the table next to the legal letter, comparing what actually happened to what Patty's lawyer was claiming. I remembered my coworker Sarah mentioning a family law attorney who helped her sister with a custody issue, so I dug through my text to find the name. Kayla Norris. I called the number Sarah had sent me even though it was almost 7 at night, expecting to leave a voicemail. A woman answered on the third ring, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could manage. She listened without interrupting and then asked a few quick questions about the timeline and whether we had documentation. When I told her about our folder with timestamps and photos, she made an approving sound. She could meet with us tomorrow morning at 9 if we could make it work. Then she warned us that even completely ridiculous lawsuits cost money to defend, and we should prepare for legal fees. I felt Brian squeeze my hand as she said that. After we hung up, we sat there doing math in our heads about how much our savings could cover. Our emergency fund had about $8,000, but we'd been planning to use some of that for a new car since Brian's was making weird noises. Now all that money might have to go to lawyers instead. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Brian slept fitfully next to me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Patty's face at the party, the way she'd looked at us with pure hatred while holding her phone. My own family had turned on me so fast it still didn't feel real. I kept thinking about all the times I'd excused their comments about my age or my choices, telling myself they meant well. But this wasn't concern. This was vindictive and cruel. My grandmother hadn't called once since the party to check if I was okay or to hear my side of the story. That hurt worse than Patty's lawsuit in some ways. At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and went to Gracie's room. She was sleeping peacefully with her favorite blanket bunched under her chin. I stood there watching her breathe, feeling so protective it made my chest hurt. Brian and I had built this little family despite everyone saying we'd fail. We had a home and jobs and a happy, healthy daughter. And now my relatives wanted to take it all away because we'd saved a child's life. I stayed in Gracie's room until the sun started coming up, just watching her sleep and promising myself I'd fight for our family no matter what it cost. The law office was in a professional building downtown, and we arrived 15 minutes early because we were both too nervous to wait at home. Kayla met us in the lobby, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She led us to a conference room and spread our folder contents across the table while asking questions. Her assessment was both comforting and scary. She said Patty's claims were legally weak because we'd followed proper medical protocol, but the case would still require a formal legal response that cost money. She looked at our timeline and called it excellent documentation. Then she explained that family lawsuits often got messy and emotional in ways that regular cases didn't. The retainer fee was $3,000 just to get started. She estimated the total cost could reach $10,000 to $15,000 if Patty actually filed in court, and we had to go through the whole process. I felt sick hearing those numbers. Brian's hand was shaking when he signed the retainer agreement. Kayla asked us to walk through exactly what happened during the seizure, and we took turns describing every detail. She nodded as we talked and made notes on a legal pad. When we finished, she confirmed we'd followed proper medical protocol exactly. Then she got really interested in Brian's book, asking about his credentials and training. She said his expertise would actually help our defense a lot. She wanted to know about our relationship with Patty before this incident. I admitted she'd always treated me like an incompetent child who couldn't handle being a mother. She'd grab Gracie without asking and make comments about me being too young, but she'd never threatened legal action before or claimed I was dangerous. Kayla wrote that down and said the pattern of behavior might be relevant. She asked if we'd had any contact with family members since the party, and I told her about the phone calls and Facebook comments. Kayla's voice got firm when we started talking about strategy. She said we absolutely could not respond to anything on social media while the legal threat was active. No posts, no comments, no trying to defend ourselves publicly. She'd send a formal response to Patty's lawyer stating we acted appropriately and rejecting all their demands. I asked if we should countersue for defamation since Patty had posted lies about us on Facebook. Kayla shook her head and explained that would escalate everything and cost even more money. The goal was to make this go away as cheaply and quickly as possible, not to punish Patty even though she deserved it. She'd include our documentation and Brian's credentials in her response to show we had a strong defense. Then she coached us on how to handle any family members who tried to contact us. Keep it brief, don't discuss the case, refer them to our attorney. Brian asked what would happen if Patty filed in court anyway, and Kayla walked us through that process. On the way home from Kayla's office, Brian was quiet for a long time. Finally, he admitted he was scared about the money. Between the legal fees and his book sales dropping, we were looking at losing maybe $20,000 or more. We sat in the car outside our house while he pulled up our bank accounts on his phone. We did the math together, calculating what we could afford if this dragged on for months. Our emergency fund would cover Kayla's retainer and maybe one more payment. After that, we'd have to dip into Gracie's college fund, which had about $15,000 we'd been saving since she was born. I felt horrible that my family's toxicity was threatening our daughter's future. Brian tried to reassure me that we could rebuild the college fund later, but I could hear the worry in his voice. We sat there for almost 20 minutes just staring at the numbers on his phone screen, both of us too overwhelmed to go inside yet. My phone rang that afternoon while I was folding laundry, and I didn't recognize the number. A professional woman's voice introduced herself as Grace Ferguson from Child Protective Services. She said they'd received a report of child endangerment involving our family and needed to schedule a home visit. My stomach felt like I'd been punched. I had to sit down on the couch because my legs went weak. Grace's tone stayed neutral and professional as she explained this was standard procedure for any report involving a young child. She needed to come see our home and talk to us about the allegations. I managed to ask what the report claimed, and she said someone had reported we had a history of neglect and had endangered a child at a family gathering. I knew immediately it was Patty. She hadn't just sued us. She'd called CPS to try to get Gracie taken away. Grace asked if tomorrow afternoon would work for a home visit, and I heard myself agreeing even though I wanted to scream. I called Kayla the second Grace hung up, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. I was talking too fast and probably not making sense, but Kayla's calm voice cut through my panic. She said CPS had to investigate every report they received, even obviously false ones. Our documentation would help a lot. She talked me through what to expect during the home visit. They'd want to see where Gracie sleeps, check our food supply, look at the general condition of our home. They'd ask questions about the party incident. I should stay calm and factual, provide our folder of documentation, and give them our pediatrician's contact information. Brian came home early from work after I texted him what happened. We spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning our already clean house, both of us anxious about strangers coming to judge whether we were fit parents. I organized Gracie's toys and made sure her room looked perfect. Brian scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed. We were exhausting ourselves with nervous energy, unable to sit still while waiting for tomorrow's visit. Gracie played happily through all of it, completely unaware that someone was coming to investigate whether her parents were good enough to keep her. The next afternoon, Grace Ferguson arrived exactly on time carrying a leather folder and wearing an expression that gave nothing away. She introduced herself calmly and asked to walk through our home, starting with the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator and watched her examine the contents, noting our fresh vegetables and milk with Gracie's name on it. She checked the pantry next, writing something on her clipboard about our stocked shelves. Brian stood nearby, answering her questions about our typical meal routines while I tried not to shake. Grace moved methodically through each room, looking in closets and checking smoke detectors. She asked about our cleaning schedule and how we organized Gracie's toys. When we reached Gracie's bedroom, our daughter bounced excitedly on her bed and grabbed her favorite stuffed elephant to show the nice lady. Grace smiled for the first time and asked Gracie about her toys. My daughter proudly displayed her books and dolls, completely unaware this woman was deciding if we were fit parents. Grace took notes while Gracie chattered about her daycare friends and her favorite bedtime stories. After touring the house, Grace sat with us at the kitchen table and asked detailed questions about the birthday party. I walked through the timeline again, explaining the seizure and our response. She wrote everything down without commenting. Brian provided copies of the seizure management chapter from his book and his pediatric first aid certifications. Grace reviewed the documents carefully and asked if we had Gracie's medical records available. I pulled out the folder we'd prepared with every vaccination record, well-child visit summary, and growth chart from the past 3 years. Our pediatrician's contact information was paperclipped to the front. Grace flipped through each page, nodding occasionally. She seemed satisfied with our documentation, but explained the investigation would remain open for at least 30 days while they verified everything with our doctor and daycare. My stomach dropped at hearing we'd be under investigation for a full month. As Grace stood to leave, she mentioned almost casually that the person who filed the report claimed we had a history of neglecting Gracie. I felt my face flush hot knowing Patty had invented complete lies. Grace handed me her card and said she'd be in touch, then walked out to her car. The second the door closed, I collapsed onto the couch and started crying. Brian sat beside me and pulled me close. He reminded me the visit went well and we had nothing to hide. I knew he was right, but the fear of losing Gracie over family lies made me feel sick. We'd done everything correctly during Zackie's seizure, and now we were being investigated like criminals. Brian held me while I cried, both of us exhausted from the stress. My phone rang an hour later and I saw it was my grandmother. I answered hoping for support, but she immediately started lecturing me about causing family drama. She said I needed to apologize to Patty and make this all go away. I tried explaining that I saved Zackie's life, but she talked right over me. She kept saying Patty was just a worried mother, and I was being selfish by not thinking about her feelings. I felt anger building in my chest, listening to her defend Patty, while ignoring what actually happened. When she started saying I should have let the adults handle the emergency, I hung up on her. I'd never done that before and immediately felt guilty and free at the same time. Brian looked at me with surprise and I told him what she'd said. He shook his head and said we didn't need that negativity right now. Later that afternoon, Brian's laptop dinged with a new email and his face went pale reading it. His publisher was officially pausing all marketing for his book until the controversy was resolved. They wrote about protecting the brand and managing negative attention. Brian stared at the screen for a long time before quietly closing his laptop. I could see tears forming in his eyes even though he was trying to hide them. His book had been doing so well, and now Patty's lies were destroying everything he'd worked for. I sat next to him and we didn't talk for a while. That evening, after putting Gracie to bed, we had a serious talk about my family. Brian said we needed to protect ourselves and Gracie even if it meant cutting people off. He'd always supported my relationship with my family despite how they treated us, but now he was angry. We agreed no more family gatherings or contact with anyone who believed Patty's lies until this was resolved. It felt sad but also necessary. My mom called the next day and I let it go to voicemail. Later, I listened to her message begging me to be the bigger person and drop the legal issues. She didn't mention that Patty sued us first, or that her granddaughter was under CPS investigation because of false reports. She just wanted me to make peace and pretend everything was fine. I didn't call her back. Protecting my daughter and husband had to come first, even if it meant losing my extended family. That same day, Rachel sent me a private message apologizing for how the party ended. She wrote that she knew I saved Zachy's life and was grateful. She admitted she was too scared of Patty to say anything publicly, but wanted me to know she didn't believe the lawsuit claims. Reading her message made me cry because it was the first support from any family member. I thanked her and told her I understood her position. At least someone saw the truth. A few days later, Kayla sent her formal response to Patty's lawyer. The letter rejected all demands and outlined our evidence that we acted correctly. She included Brian's credentials, our complete timeline, and a statement from our pediatrician confirming proper seizure management. The letter was professional but firm, making it clear we wouldn't be scared into paying money or apologizing for saving a child's life. Kayla emailed us a copy and I felt proud reading it. We were fighting back instead of just taking the abuse. 2 weeks after the party, Patty's lawyer responded demanding we agree to mediation, or they'd file the lawsuit in court. Kayla called to explain that mediation might actually help, because it was cheaper than court, and could resolve things faster. I didn't want to sit in a room with Patty after everything she'd done. But Kayla said mediation gave us a chance to end this nightmare sooner, without the expense of a trial. Brian and I talked it over and agreed to try mediation, hoping we could put this behind us and move on with our lives. A few days later, Grace called to schedule follow-up visits. Her voice stayed neutral and professional as she explained they needed to interview Brian and me separately about our parenting. She also mentioned they'd be talking to our daycare provider and pediatrician as part of the investigation. I gripped my phone tighter and forced myself to sound calm while confirming the appointment times. After hanging up, I sat on the couch staring at nothing, feeling like we were being punished for saving Zachy's life. Brian found me there 20 minutes later and wrapped his arms around me without saying anything. The morning of my CPS interview, I put on my nicest work clothes and drove to their office building downtown. Grace led me to a small conference room with a recording device on the table. She asked me to walk through my medical training from the beginning, so I explained my certification process, continuing education hours, and specific emergency response protocols I'd learned. When I got to the birthday party incident, I provided way more detail than during the home visit, describing exactly how I positioned Zachy, why I chose each action, and what signs I monitored throughout the seizure. Grace wrote constantly in her notebook, occasionally asking clarifying questions about my family relationships. I told her the truth about years of judgment and criticism, how they treated Brian and me like incompetent children despite our success. She nodded and kept writing, but her face gave away nothing about whether she believed me or Patty's lies. The interview lasted 90 minutes, and when it ended, I had no idea if I'd helped our case or made things worse. Brian's interview happened 2 days later, and when he got home, he seemed cautiously hopeful. Grace had asked detailed questions about his book and parenting philosophy, spending extra time on the seizure management chapter. He walked her through the exact protocol we followed at the party, showing her the published guidelines we'd referenced. She seemed impressed by his credentials and research, asking where he'd gotten his information and how he verified medical accuracy. Brian felt like she could see we actually knew what we were doing, but we both understood the waiting would be awful until CPS made their final decision. That same week, Dr. Pearl Norris called while I was folding laundry in the living room. She started by saying CPS had contacted her for a reference, and she'd given us a glowing review. Her voice was angry as she said she was appalled anyone would question our parenting after seeing how well we care for Gracie. She offered to provide a written statement for our legal case, and I thanked her so many times I probably sounded ridiculous. Having a professional who actually knew us confirm we were good parents meant everything after weeks of family accusations. 2 days later, the daycare director, Bella Armstrong, reached out with similar news. She explained that CPS had interviewed her about Gracie, and she'd told them our daughter was well cared for, happy, and hitting all her developmental milestones right on schedule. Bella mentioned she'd worked in childcare for 20 years, and we were among the most attentive and engaged parents she'd ever seen. I started crying on the phone with her, surprised by how much I needed to hear those words from someone outside our situation. She told me to stay strong and that the truth would come out, which made me cry even harder. 3 weeks after Rachel's birthday party, we drove to a neutral mediation office across town. Kayla met us in the parking lot and we walked in together, my stomach twisting when I saw Patty and Dennis already sitting in the waiting area with their lawyer. Patty glared at me like I was some kind of monster who'd hurt her family on purpose. The mediator was an older woman named Sandra who led us all into a conference room and explained the ground rules. She emphasized that everything said in mediation was private, and we were here to find a solution both sides could accept. Patty's lawyer opened by claiming we'd caused Zachy severe trauma through our negligence, and their family deserved compensation for immense emotional distress. He talked about how scared they'd been watching their son have a seizure, and how our failure to act properly had made everything worse. Kayla stayed completely calm as she presented our evidence, laying out the timeline, Brian's credentials, and medical documentation proving we'd handled the seizure correctly. She walked through each action we took and matched it to proper protocol from multiple medical sources. The mediator asked Patty's lawyer to provide any medical evidence that we'd acted wrong, and he admitted they didn't have any. Sandra called for a private caucus and led Kayla, Brian, and me to a smaller room down the hall. Kayla closed the door and told us Patty's case was falling apart, but they might still file in court just to be spiteful. She recommended offering a mutual agreement where both sides dropped all claims and agreed to no future contact. I felt anger rise in my chest at the idea of any agreement that didn't include Patty admitting she'd lied about everything. Kayla explained gently that getting Patty to admit fault was completely unrealistic, and we needed to focus on ending this nightmare. When we went back to the main room, Sandra suggested a settlement where everyone agreed to stop all legal action and public statements about the incident. Patty immediately cut in, demanding we pay her $10,000, and Brian issue a public apology for his dangerous parenting advice. Her voice was sharp and greedy, showing she was still just after our money. Kayla firmly rejected any payment, and the mediation ended with no agreement reached. Sandra looked disappointed as she explained that meant Patty would likely file her lawsuit in court. We left the building feeling defeated and angry after wasting 4 hours and racking up more legal fees for nothing. Brian stayed quiet during the drive home, staring out the window at passing traffic. He finally admitted he was worried about the money, how the legal costs kept piling up, and how much worse this could get if we ended up in actual court. I squeezed his hand and promised we'd get through this together, but inside I was scared about how we'd afford everything, and what would happen if CPS didn't close their investigation soon. The next day, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail requiring my signature, and my hands shook as I signed for it, knowing exactly what was inside. I sat at our kitchen table and pulled out the legal documents, seeing Patty's name at the top of a formal lawsuit claiming $50,000 in damages for negligence, emotional distress, and child endangerment. The complaint was filled with legal language that made everything feel more real and scary than Patty's threats at the party. It described how we allegedly failed to act appropriately during Zachy's medical emergency and caused severe trauma to their family. I read through page after page of lies presented as facts, my stomach twisting as I saw how Patty's lawyer twisted the seizure incident into something we did wrong. Brian read over my shoulder, and I felt him tense up as we got to the part demanding we stop selling his book and issue a public apology. I immediately called Kayla, and she asked me to scan and email everything right away, so she could review it. She called back an hour later and tried to reassure us that the claims were still legally weak, but her tone was more serious now. We were officially in a lawsuit with all the costs and stress that came with it, no longer just dealing with threats, but actual court proceedings. Kayla explained we'd need to file a formal response within 30 days, and warned that Patty's lawyer would likely drag this out as long as possible. The retainer we'd paid was already half gone, and she estimated we'd need at least another $5,000 to get through the initial phases. I hung up feeling sick about the money and terrified about what would happen if a judge somehow believed Patty's version of events. 3 days later, Brian was checking his book's Amazon page like he did every morning when his face went completely white. He turned his laptop toward me, and I saw his rating had dropped from 8 stars to 4. One overnight with 17 new 1-star reviews. I read through them, and they were all posted within hours of each other. Clearly fake accounts leaving identical complaints about dangerous advice. One review claimed Brian's seizure protocol nearly killed their nephew. Another said his book encouraged teen parents to ignore medical professionals. By the end of the week, his rating was down to 3. 2 stars, and his sales had dropped by 60% according to his publisher dashboard. Brian sat at our kitchen table scrolling through the hateful reviews with tears running down his face, watching years of hard work get destroyed by Patty's coordinated attack. He'd worked so hard researching and writing that book to help other young parents, and now it was used as ammunition against us. I stood behind him, rubbing his shoulders as he clicked through review after review, all posted by brand new accounts with no other activity. His publisher emailed asking if he wanted to respond to the reviews, but Kayla had warned us not to engage with anything Patty might be behind. I watched my husband's dream of helping other families crumble while we couldn't even defend ourselves publicly. That night, I woke up at 2 a.m. and reached for Brian, but his side of the bed was empty. I found him sitting in the rocking chair in Gracie's room just watching her sleep, his face wet with tears in the dim glow of her nightlight. He didn't look up when I came in, just kept staring at our daughter like he was trying to memorize her face. I knelt beside the chair and put my hand on his knee, waiting for him to talk when he was ready. He finally whispered that he was scared we'd lose everything we'd built together. Our savings, our reputation, maybe even Gracie if CPS believed Patty's lies. His voice cracked as he said he'd worked so hard on his book to prove we were good parents and help other young families, and now it was used to destroy us. I climbed into his lap in that rocking chair meant for holding Gracie and held him while he cried, both of us exhausted from weeks of stress and feeling helpless against Patty's attacks. We sat there for over an hour just holding each other in the dark, listening to Gracie's peaceful breathing and trying to remember why we were fighting so hard. My phone rang during my lunch break at work, and I saw Grace's number, my heart immediately racing as I answered. She got straight to the point and said CPS had completed their investigation and found no evidence of neglect or endangerment in our home. I actually started crying right there in the hospital break room as she explained they'd interviewed everyone, reviewed all our documentation, and determined Gracie was well cared for and thriving. Grace said they'd be officially closing the case and sending a letter confirming our home was safe and appropriate for raising children. I thanked her over and over through my tears, weeks of fear finally lifting as she assured me the investigation was completely closed. She mentioned that the person who filed the report had made claims that weren't supported by any evidence they found, which felt like validation that Patty had lied. When I hung up, I sat in that break room crying with relief for 10 minutes before I could pull myself together enough to call Brian. He answered on the first ring, and I could barely get the words out to tell him CPS was closing the case. I heard him start crying too, and we just stayed on the phone breathing together for a minute, both too emotional to speak. The official CPS closure letter arrived 2 days later in a plain white envelope, and I read it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. The letter stated clearly that their investigation found no evidence to support the allegations of neglect or endangerment, and the case was officially closed. I immediately scanned it and emailed it to Kayla, then called to make sure she got it. She was excited when she answered and said this significantly weakened Patty's lawsuit since CPS finding no merit to the claims would be powerful evidence. Kayla explained that having an official government agency investigate and clear us might even convince Patty's lawyer to drop the whole case. I asked if we should send it to my family to prove Patty lied, but Kayla said no contact meant no contact, even with good news. I took the letter to a frame shop that afternoon and had it professionally framed, then hung it on our bedroom wall as a reminder that we were good parents no matter what my family said. Brian stood looking at it that night and said it was the most important document we owned besides Gracie's birth certificate. At work the next week, I was finishing up paperwork when the overhead system announced a code blue in pediatrics. I ran to the room and found a 6-year-old boy choking on a piece of candy, his mother screaming while he turned blue. I moved on autopilot, getting behind him and performing the Heimlich maneuver exactly like my training taught me. The candy flew out after 3 compressions and the kid started crying and breathing normally. His mother hugged me sobbing with relief while I checked his vitals and made sure he was okay. My supervisor was standing in the doorway and she pulled me aside after we'd calmed the family down. She said she'd watched me handle that emergency with the same calm skill I showed during Zaki's seizure at the party. Her exact words were that she never doubted my abilities despite the complaints my family had called in about me. That compliment meant more than she probably knew, because Patty's accusations had made me second-guess myself, even though I knew I'd done everything right. Walking back to my station, I felt some of my confidence returning, remembering that I was actually good at my job no matter what my family said. Kayla called a few days later sounding cautiously optimistic as she explained she was filing a motion to dismiss Patty's lawsuit based on the CPS findings and lack of medical evidence. She walked me through the legal argument that Patty couldn't prove we acted improperly, when every official investigation and medical expert said otherwise. The judge would review our motion and Patty's response before deciding whether to dismiss or let the case continue to trial. Kayla warned that even with our strong evidence, the process could still take months, because courts moved slowly. She also mentioned that our legal fees had now reached $8,000 between the retainer, mediation, and filing the motion. Brian and I sat down that night and looked at our bank account, doing math we didn't want to do. We'd already drained most of our savings, and now we had to pause contributions to Gracie's college fund, just to cover our legal costs. It made me furious that we were spending money meant for our daughter's future just to defend ourselves against Patty's lies. My phone buzzed with a message from Rachel a week later, and I almost didn't open it, not sure I could handle more family drama. But her message said Zaki had been to a pediatric neurologist for a follow-up after the seizure. She'd taken a photo of the doctor's report, and it clearly stated that Zaki had experienced a typical febrile seizure, and our response had been medically appropriate. The neurologist's notes specifically mentioned that turning him on his side and monitoring the seizure duration was the correct protocol. Rachel wrote that she wished she could testify on our behalf, but Patty had forbidden any family contact with us, and she was scared of the consequences. I immediately screenshot everything she sent and forwarded it to Kayla as more evidence. Even though Rachel couldn't support us publicly, having that doctor's report felt like proof that we'd done everything right. I sent her a quick thank you message and told her I understood her position, grateful that at least one family member saw the truth. That same week, my grandmother left a voicemail that I listened to on speaker with Brian. Her voice was sharp and accusing as she said I'd torn the family apart and needed to fix this mess before the holidays. She went on about how Patty was just a worried mother, and I was being selfish by dragging this out with lawyers and court filings. Not once did she mention that Patty had sued us first, or filed false CPS reports that could have gotten Gracie taken away. According to grandmother, I was the problem for not apologizing and keeping the peace like a good family member should. I saved the voicemail and sent it to Kayla as evidence of the ongoing family pressure, but I didn't call grandmother back. Brian squeezed my hand and said I didn't owe anyone an apology for protecting our family, and he was right, even though it hurt to be blamed for everything. Brian got an email a few days later from a parenting podcast called Real Talk for Young Parents, and the host wanted to interview him about handling false accusations. She'd read about our case on some parenting forum and thought our story would help other young parents facing family judgment. Brian showed me the email and said he didn't know if going public was a good idea, worried it might make things worse with Patty. I called Kayla and asked her opinion, expecting her to say no, but she surprised me by saying a podcast interview might actually help rebuild Brian's reputation after the review bombing destroyed his book ratings. She explained that telling our side of the story to a supportive audience could counteract Patty's lies and show people what really happened. Brian and I talked about it for hours that night, weighing the risks of going public against the chance to finally tell the truth. We decided he'd do the interview because staying silent hadn't protected us, and maybe the truth reaching more people would help. Brian emailed the host back and scheduled the recording for the following week, both of us hoping this was the right choice. The podcast recording happened 3 days later at a small studio downtown. Brian sat across from the host wearing his nicest button-down shirt, the one I'd ironed that morning while he practiced his talking points. The host started by asking how we met, and Brian told the story of us being lab partners in high school biology, which made everything feel more real and less like a legal defense. When she asked about the birthday party incident, Brian pulled out his phone and walked through the timeline we'd documented. He explained febrile seizures using simple terms about how high fevers can trigger them in young kids, and how they look scary, but usually aren't dangerous if you know what to do. The host asked what he'd recommend to parents who witness a seizure, and Brian listed the steps exactly like his book chapter outlined them. Turn the child on their side, start timing, remove tight clothing, don't put anything in their mouth, stay calm and speak soothingly. He talked about how panic makes everything worse, and how having basic medical knowledge as a parent isn't about being perfect, but about being prepared. The host mentioned the lawsuit, and Brian's voice stayed steady as he said, "Sometimes doing the right thing means facing consequences from people who don't understand." She asked about the book, and he explained how he'd written it because he was tired of young parents being treated like they couldn't possibly know what they're doing. The interview lasted 40 minutes, and when Brian came home he looked exhausted, but lighter somehow, like finally telling our actual story to someone who listened had lifted weight off his shoulders. I hugged him in our kitchen and asked how it felt, and he said it felt like maybe people would finally hear the truth instead of Patty's lies. The podcast episode went live the next Tuesday, and I listened to it during my lunch break at work, sitting in my car with my phone pressed to my ear. Brian sounded so calm and knowledgeable explaining everything, and the host kept praising his book and his approach to evidence-based parenting. The comments section filled up fast with listeners saying they'd never heard of febrile seizures before and were grateful for the education. Several people wrote that they were ordering Brian's book right away because they wanted that kind of practical parenting information. One comment said her own mother had sued her over a similar family dispute, and she felt less alone hearing our story. I screenshot the positive comments and sent them to Brian at work, watching the 3 dots appear as he typed back that maybe this was the beginning of things turning around. 2 weeks after the podcast aired, Brian checked his book sales dashboard and actually gasped loud enough that I ran into his office thinking something was wrong. His sales had jumped 30% from their lowest point and were climbing daily as more people found the podcast episode. The reviews section showed new 5-star ratings from listeners who said they'd bought the book after hearing him speak and found it incredibly helpful. Brian sat back in his desk chair staring at the numbers like he couldn't quite believe them, and I watched his eyes get wet as months of stress started cracking. His publisher emailed that same afternoon with a carefully worded message asking if the negative publicity had died down enough to resume their marketing campaign. Brian read the email out loud, and I could hear the hurt in his voice when he said they'd abandoned him, so fast when things got hard. I sat on the edge of his desk and reminded him that at least they were coming back now, and he nodded but said he'd never forget how quickly they pulled their support. He drafted a professional response saying he'd be open to discussing renewed marketing efforts and copied me on it before hitting send. Kayla called on a Thursday morning while I was getting Gracie dressed for daycare, and I almost dropped my phone when I heard the excitement in her voice. The judge had granted our motion to dismiss most of Patty's claims, leaving only a weak emotional distress allegation that Kayla said wouldn't hold up in court. She explained that Patty's lawyer had reached out suggesting they might be willing to settle for a mutual agreement to drop everything with no money changing hands. I actually screamed with relief, and Gracie looked up at me confused while I tried to explain to Kayla how much this meant. 2 months of legal hell were finally showing progress, and I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time since the birthday party. Kayla warned me not to celebrate too much yet because we still needed to get through another mediation session, but her tone said she was confident we'd finally found our way out. I called Brian at work immediately after hanging up with Kayla, and he went silent for a long moment before saying he'd been terrified this would drag on for years. We agreed to the mediation session that weekend, both of us desperate to end this nightmare even if it meant sitting across from Patty again. The second mediation happened at the same office as before, but the whole atmosphere felt different this time. Patty's lawyer looked tired and kept glancing at his notes like he knew his case had fallen apart. The mediator welcomed us back and laid out the proposed agreement where all legal claims would be dropped by both sides, and we'd agree to no future contact. Patty sat with her arms crossed, glaring at me while her lawyer explained that they were willing to accept mutual dismissal without any financial settlement. Kayla calmly presented our position that we'd never pay a single dollar for saving Zacky's life and doing everything correctly. The mediator worked through the details of the agreement, specifying that no party would admit fault, and all public statements about the incident would cease. Patty's lawyer kept trying to negotiate for some kind of apology from us, and Kayla shut it down every time, reminding everyone that the judge had already dismissed most of their claims. The mediation lasted 3 hours with multiple private caucuses where Kayla would pull Brian and me into a separate room to discuss strategy. During one of these breaks, Brian squeezed my hand and said he just wanted this over, so we could get back to our lives. Patty refused to apologize or admit she'd done anything wrong, sitting stone-faced while her lawyer read through the final agreement terms. She did agree to remove her false Facebook post and stop making any public statements about us or the incident. The mediator asked if we could all agree to these terms, and Kayla looked at me for confirmation before nodding, yes. It wasn't the vindication I'd dreamed about where Patty would have to publicly admit she'd lied and apologize for trying to destroy us. Kayla explained quietly that this was actually a good outcome because it ended the legal case without trial and got us out from under the constant stress. Brian and I signed the agreement at the conference table, our signatures shaky from exhaustion and relief. Patty signed without looking at us, and her lawyer gathered his papers quickly like he wanted to escape. Walking out of that office felt surreal, knowing the lawsuit was finally over, but also knowing Patty would never acknowledge what she'd done to us. That evening, Brian and I sat at our kitchen table with all our legal bills spread out in front of us, adding up the final total. $12,000 in attorney fees, court costs, and related expenses. Our savings account that we'd built up so carefully over 3 years was almost empty. I felt sick looking at the numbers and thinking about how we'd paid all that money just to defend ourselves against lies. Brian pulled out his laptop and opened a spreadsheet to create a budget for rebuilding our emergency fund over the next year. We calculated how much we could save each month if we cut back on eating out and postponed some home repairs we'd been planning. It was frustrating that Patty's vindictiveness had cost us so much money and peace of mind, but at least the case was over and we could start moving forward. I looked at Gracie playing with her blocks in the living room and reminded myself that protecting our family had been worth every dollar. With the legal case officially resolved, Brian and I had a serious conversation about boundaries with my family. We agreed we needed to establish no contact with Patty, Dennis, and my grandmother, who'd never once supported us through any of this. I drafted a message to my mom explaining that we couldn't maintain relationships with people who believed we'd endanger a child and who'd supported Patty's lawsuit. My mom called immediately after reading it, her voice hurt and confused as she asked how I could cut off my own grandmother. I explained as calmly as I could that grandmother had called me selfish and blamed me for tearing the family apart instead of acknowledging that Patty had sued us first. My mom argued that family should forgive and forget, that holding grudges only hurt everyone. I told her I was done prioritizing other people's comfort over my family's safety and mental health. She went quiet for a long moment before saying she hoped I'd change my mind someday, and I said maybe someday, but not now. Hanging up that call felt both terrible and necessary, like cutting off an infected limb to save the rest of the body. Rachel sent me a message 2 weeks later asking if we could meet for coffee, and I stared at my phone for 10 minutes trying to decide if I could trust any family member after everything. I finally agreed to meet at a coffee shop near my work, choosing a public place where I'd feel safer. Rachel showed up 5 minutes early looking nervous, ordering a latte and sitting across from me at a small table by the window. She apologized immediately for not defending us publicly, and explained she'd been terrified of Patty's retaliation after watching what happened to us. I appreciated her honesty even though part of me was still angry she'd stayed silent while Patty destroyed our reputation. Rachel said she'd known all along that we'd saved Zacky's life, and the lawsuit was completely wrong, but she'd been too scared to speak up. We talked for over an hour about family dynamics, and how Patty controlled everyone through fear and manipulation. I told Rachel I was willing to slowly rebuild our relationship, but made it clear that any future contact required respecting our boundaries around Patty and grandmother. She agreed without hesitation, and said she understood why we'd gone no contact with certain family members. Brian's book sales continued climbing steadily over the following weeks, as more people discovered the podcast episode and positive word-of-mouth spread. His publisher called to discuss a second printing with updated marketing materials, and Brian negotiated better terms this time, having learned from how quickly they'd abandoned him before. He started working on a second book about handling family criticism as a young parent, channeling all the pain from our experience into something that might help other people going through similar situations. I'd watch him typing at his desk late at night, pouring everything we'd survived into chapters about setting boundaries and protecting your nuclear family. He'd read sections out loud to me, and I'd cry sometimes hearing our story transformed into advice that could help someone else. Watching him turn this trauma into something purposeful made me incredibly proud of how we'd handled everything, how we'd refused to let Patty's vindictiveness break us. 3 months after the birthday party, Gracie had her regular checkup with Dr. Norris, and I carried her into the familiar exam room feeling almost normal again. Dr. Norris did her usual thorough examination, checking Gracie's growth, development, and overall health. She commented on how happy and healthy Gracie looked, meeting all her milestones and clearly thriving. When the exam finished, Dr. Norris asked how Brian and I were doing after everything we'd been through, and I was honest that we were still recovering financially and emotionally from the lawsuit. She sat down on her rolling stool and looked at me seriously, saying she wanted me to hear this clearly. We were excellent parents, and Gracie was thriving specifically because of the love and care we provided. All the judgment from my family, all the accusations and legal threats, none of that changed the fact that we were doing an amazing job raising our daughter. I cried in that exam room while Gracie played with the toy stethoscope, finally hearing validation from someone whose professional opinion actually mattered. The following Saturday afternoon, we took Gracie to the park, and I watched her climb on the playground equipment without the constant worry that had lived in my chest for months. She laughed as she went down the slide, and I actually felt relaxed instead of scanning for threats or waiting for the next crisis. Brian wrapped his arm around me while we sat on the bench and told me he was proud of how we protected our family through everything. I leaned into him and felt grateful for our little unit, even if it meant being disconnected from most of my extended family. Gracie ran over, demanding we push her on the swings, and we took turns sending her higher while she squealed with joy. The simplicity of the moment felt almost foreign after months of legal stress and family drama. On Monday at work, my coworker Jennifer pulled me aside during our break and mentioned that her sister went through something similar with vindictive in-laws who tried using the legal system against her. She offered to connect us for support if I wanted to talk to someone who understood what we'd been through. I realized we weren't alone in dealing with toxic family dynamics, and there was actually a whole community of people who'd had to choose their nuclear family over extended relatives. Jennifer said her sister came out stronger and happier after setting firm boundaries, which helped knowing others had survived this and rebuilt their lives. She gave me her sister's contact information, and I thanked her, feeling less isolated than I had in months. That night, after putting Gracie to bed, Brian and I sat on our couch reviewing everything we'd been through over the past few months. We acknowledged how much stronger we were now after handling a medical emergency, a frivolous lawsuit, a CPS investigation, and complete family betrayal while still being great parents to Gracie. Our life looked different from I'd imagined back when I was pregnant at 18 with my whole family predicting I'd fail. We had limited contact with most of my relatives now, and our savings account was seriously depleted from legal fees. But sitting there with Brian's arm around me and our daughter sleeping peacefully in her room, I felt genuinely happy and secure in the family we'd built together. That was everything that mattered. Well, that's the groundbreaking ending nobody saw coming. If you're still here, congratulations, you've survived my nonsense. Go ahead and subscribe, because clearly, you've got the stamina for chaos. I'll see you in the next questionable decision.